Welcome back, Alchemists. This is Cauldron, and today I want to take a look at more Cauldron recipes. I just finished my second playthrough. It was challenge run. It was a storefront playthrough where we're not selling anything to any customers, and we were just using purchase contracts and daily quests to make money, but mostly purchase contracts. And this challenge honestly made me look a bit different at Cauldron recipes because not every of my old recipes was feasible at early stages of the game, and I needed to be more cautious about certain costs, about fertilizer cost and fuel costs for the cauldrons, also about simply coin costs, gold costs, silver costs. So yeah, not every recipe was sustainable early game, but in later game things got way easier, way more affordable, way more easy. But early game was the struggle with certain recipes. So yeah, I did a lot of research. I've refurbished a lot of my recipes. And probably the most notable gonna be the very first recipe is bronze, because my old bronze recipe was chamomile, lavender, and double chamomile. Why was this recipe not feasible in the beginning of the game? Simply because the nutrient values, the nutrient requirements for chamomile and lavender was not sustainable enough, because chamomile needed 720 of a nutrient value, and lavender needed pretty much triple that value, 2160. And at that stage of the game, I don't remember what fertilizer I had, probably growth potion, and it was not worth doing it this way. It was not given enough of fertilizer value to even produce all that. So I had to go a different route, and this is the route I took. I was producing bronze out of black powder, coal, and plank, and I was making black powder out of double chamomile or chamomile and chamomile powder, not double chamomile, and coal. So that was black powder, and I was sending it down into the cauldron below using plank, coal, and black powder, and that's how I started producing impure copper powder to start smelting it into bronze. I got more bronze and obviously started producing cauldrons, because without bronze you cannot make any cauldrons, therefore you cannot make any cauldron builds. So that was bronze, and since I was making bronze out of black powder, let's take a look at black powder builds as well, because I had quite a few of them as well. So the black powder I used in my very first build was chamomile powder, chamomile, and coal. It's not super expensive, but there's a couple more recipes. If I wanted to step away from using fertilizer, and if I only wanted to use, let's say, coins, I could use a gelatinous gridlock, copper coin, and coal. Also not that expensive build, simply does not involve any chamomile. That's if at that stage of the game I had too much pressure on my fertilizer and I didn't want to build another fertilizer build. This was very sufficient build. Obviously later in the game I stepped away from those builds and I simply used my old red current, double red current with a lavender build, because it's also not that expensive, but it's just tinier, it's smaller build. And I just used that one further down the road later in the game when I was able to support enough fertilizer. So clay was obviously without any change, because clay was always affordable build, but this is very nice build, red currant, sage, and sage powder. So this is just two nurseries, because sage and sage powder is the same nursery, and red currant. And it produces very healthy amount of clay, so you don't need that many of cauldrons for this. It's very good build. Clay is honestly very easy build. Well, Gloom spores is another build that at early stages it looked way different from later stages. So I was producing Gloom spores out of chamomile powder, and sulfur, which I was producing sulfur and sending it down out of the same chamomile powder, and black powder. And black powder was produced exactly the same way, a chamomile powder, and coal. So pretty much same way as I used for my bronze production. And everything intermediates was sent down, and the final cauldron was producing Gloom spores. This is not the most efficient, this is not the best way to produce it, but there was a rather inexpensive way to produce it. And also, since everything involved chamomile and chamomile powder, this was just one nursery for chamomile, split into two to used just raw chamomile and grind it into powder as well. And the only additional builds I had was the coal grinder, and well, and that's it. Yeah, so just chamomile and coal. So that was it. Further down, the Gloom spores could have been done this way: chamomile powder, and lavender. Right? This is less fertilizer intensive build than, let's say, this build with double lavender and chamomile. Because if you have two of the same items in a cauldron, the values that they provide for the cauldron item is multiplied by 0.65 or 65%. Therefore, you get less of the cauldron value out of items if you use two of the items, but typically they are more expensive items, and in this case lavender is more expensive when it comes to the nutrient value. So yeah, this is overall better build, consumes less nutrients, and this is just cheaper build on nutrient because it doesn't consume lavender whatsoever. So yep, triple lavender, Gloom spore, very expensive build. Obviously, this is going to be the most expensive one, but it's just going to take one nursery behind it. Obviously, it depends on how many Gloom spores you need, because one nursery is going to produce limited amount of lavender, and that amount that nursery produces you just divide by 3, and that's how many Gloom spores you can support with that nursery. But this is going to be the most expensive when it comes to the nutrient value, right? This one is less expensive. This one is even less expensive. And this one was my beginner build, or the very first one I built to even start producing Gloom spores. When it comes to copper powder, well, there are builds for copper powder, like let's say this one, double lavender and Gloom spores, and Gloom spores can be produced in any of those builds. But when it comes to copper powder, honestly, I prefer just to simply smelt coins into copper ingots. It just turns out to be cheaper, less headache, faster. Yeah, I just prefer doing this way. That's my way of doing it. Next thing that's very important is salt, and salt used in so many recipes. And the recipe that I used was flax fiber, and chamomile. It's a very cheap recipe because you only use in 2 nurseries, and flax does not consume that much of nutrient value whatsoever, and chamomile is not as expensive as lavender, for example, but it provides very, very healthy amount of salt. Another way to produce salt is double chamomile, but again, when we use double of the same item in the cauldron, it's not the most efficient build, but it's still a viable build nevertheless. So, and if we take a look at another one, salt can also be done out of chamomile, red currant, and flax. I think this was my very first build, the oldest build that I've ever made for salt production. This is obviously includes 3 nurseries. This one is just 2 nurseries, and this one is also 2 nurseries, but we're using 2 flax items that's produced out of flax nursery instead of using 2 chamomile nurseries, or 2 items out of chamomile. So yeah, this one's gonna be probably the most efficient and the cheapest recipe for salt, therefore my preferred recipe. If we take a look at unstable catalyst, this might be not the most efficient or not the cheapest build out there, but this is the build that I prefer. This is the build that works for me, and honestly, with the size of the build, because I'm just using 1 nursery of gentian, which produces 2 items out of it, and I can use as a third item, I can use anything of a similar value to plank, and it could be stone, it could be copper coin, right? Anything that can be placed into there. Nothing that's more expensive than that. But yeah, that's unstable catalyst. And vitality essence. Why we're looking at 2 of them together? Because unstable catalyst and vitality essence are 2 of the components to produce fertile catalyst. They're very often used together. So, and also a recipe for vitality essence also could not be the best recipe, but just the recipe that I prefer and I use in most of my builds is gentian nectar, and chamomile. And I prefer this recipe way better than just burning Oblivion essence. But vitality essence, this is a fantastic recipe. Alright, let's take a look at Oblivion essence. The Oblivion essence, there's quite a few ways to produce it. Crucible. And the first or the earliest recipe that I use, I just use limestone because limestone is not as expensive and it produces a very good amount of Oblivion essence. It's going to be very high amount for the stage where you're at in the game when you start using Oblivion essences. And when I step away from using that, the next thing I start using is Gentian Nectar and Gentian Flower. I mix them together, I use both at the same time, and they produce almost the same amount, and it just averages out between two of them. As an alternative, lavender can be used also to produce Oblivion Essence. It's not going to produce as much as, for example, Gentian Nectar or Stone. It's going to produce a bit less. Also, Gelatinous Gridlock can be used as well. It's going to produce the least amount, but it also consumes the least amount of heat value. But at no point in the game ever I needed to use anything else but Stone or Gentian Nectar and Gentian Flower. So I mostly use just these two recipes. I start with one, and when I upgrade and I have better fertilizer options, I proceed to using Gentian Nectar, and pretty much never use lavender or Gelatinous Gridlock or anything else. And obviously I don't use any Cauldron recipe for Oblivion Essence because they're just not worth it. The recipes, I could not find any good recipe for it. Recipes do exist, they're just not good. I don't like them. Let's take a look at Sulfur. And this is a recipe that I used in my current playthrough. Chamomile powder, and black powder. This was a very inexpensive recipe, but there are also other ways to produce sulfur. And if we take a look, sulfur can be produced out of lavender, chamomile, and flax. If you prefer to go completely plant-based production. And again, what I was saying, I was producing sulfur differently because lavender consumes a lot of nutrient value, and at the point in the game where I needed to produce sulfur, I did not have good enough fertilizer for that, therefore I did not use lavender. But if you're further down in the game, you definitely can use lavender. Or if you prefer to go a different way, you can use lavender, coal, and plank. Also produces sulfur. A little bit less heavy on fertilizer because you only need fertilizer for lavender. But honestly, not that much difference whatsoever. Now let's proceed to gems, because gems used in the production of mercury. And there are quite a few ways to produce gems. So turquoise, the recipe I used in this playthrough was chamomile powder, and flax. Very easy recipe, you just have two nurseries behind it, and it produces very good amount of turquoise. But alternatively, you can use coal, coke, and coke powder. Also very interesting recipe. It's like a meme recipe because you're just using coal ore, you just grind it and use the same coal to make coke and then coke powder. So, and you're just using coal itself, just everything that coal produces to make turquoise. And technically, you can use 2 grinders for 4 cauldrons if you ever need 4 cauldrons worth of turquoise, but that's pretty much the ratios that can be used. Let's take a look at malachite. The recipe I used was chamomile, coal, and copper ingot, but honestly, after looking a bit deeper into that, I probably should have used this recipe, which is chamomile powder, and copper ingot, because these two come from the same nursery, and I did not have to use coal ore and grinder for it. It would have been just tiny bit heavier on the fertilizer because I would use chamomile more often in this recipe. But other than that, it would just take a bit less space. But both recipes are viable. Well, let's take a look at topaz. This is the recipe I used. It was gelatinous gridlock, silver coin, and lavender. But if you want to go some funny ways and work with meme recipes, you can just go gentian nectar, and gentian powder. Just everything out of the same nursery, and also you produce in topaz. It's very, very funny recipe. Anyways, let's take a look at obsidian. This is probably my staple and standard obsidian recipe that I always use. Fertile catalyst, chamomile, and silver coin. And I use a lot of obsidian because I use it as obsidian itself. I also grind obsidian into the obsidian powder. But here's another recipe. I honestly never use this. It can be viable if you have too much of unstable catalyst, or if you don't mind putting another build of it. and you can use coins to make copper ingots. But nevertheless, another recipe, right? Not the one that I use. I use this one, but still viable. Well, lapis lazuli. This is, yeah, that's an interesting gem to work with. There's quite a few recipes. It's honestly not as easy to produce, but the ways I handled it, I used fertile catalyst, silver ingot, and crude gold dust. But that's when I was producing it in bulk for mercury. In my smaller builds, for example, for silver amulet, I used this recipe, copper coin, world tree leaf, and Panacea Potion, because I didn't need to produce that much. I just needed to produce one Cauldron, therefore I didn't use that much of a Panacea Potion. Or this is another build I also used, was copper coin, fertile catalyst, and Panacea Potion. So yeah, quite a few ways to produce lapis lazuli. Honestly, there's way more recipes, right? I'm not saying that my recipes are best recipes or most efficient or cheapest. These are just the ones that I used and I found to be easier for me to handle. So that's why I use those recipes. Let's take a look at crude silver, because crude silver used in quite a few recipes, and mostly you're going to use it for the quicksilver. And this is the way I produced it. Gentian, Gentian nectar, and unstable catalyst. Or this is another way I produced it, was also Gentian, Gentian nectar, or silver coin. Both recipes are viable. The one with silver coin is going to be more expensive, but smaller. This one's going to be less expensive, but you need another build for unstable catalyst, so therefore it's going to be a bit bigger build. But both recipes are viable. Silver powder. Honestly, I did not need silver powder because I produce silver ingots by simply smelting silver coins. But because in my Panacea Potion production I had excess of gentian powder and I was just simply throwing it away, I decided to use it to produce silver powder and further smelt it into the silver ingots. So fertile catalyst, gentian powder, and copper coin. Or another way to produce it, fertile catalyst, copper ingot, and copper coin, and that's how we produce silver powder. Again, not the most useful recipe. I have not used it for much, and I only used it because I had access of gentian powder. But this recipe exists, and it can be used if needed. Stardust. Stardust is a big recipe because it's used in very high quantities to produce moon tier. That's required for Luna production, also required for the Moonlit soap. And this is probably hands down the best recipe and probably also the cheapest recipe out there. Obviously there are other recipes, but I would not recommend anything else but this, because this is, again, the best recipe when it comes to what it consumes and ease of production, cheapest, and I use it all the time. Fertile catalyst, unstable catalyst, and silver coin. The only problem with Stardust that it's produced in very small quantities, and this much is produced with level 12 factory efficiency. So yeah, you need a lot of cauldrons. But yeah, this is probably the easier way to produce Stardust than use all three of the lower relics. Crude gold and crude gold dust. I used it a lot in, for example, lapis lazuli production. Crude gold dust can be made in a few different ways. The way I produced it was fertile catalyst, crude silver powder, and silver ingot. But it also can be done with fertile catalyst, unstable catalyst, and obsidian. And we already took a look at how to produce obsidian. Or fertile catalyst, silver coin, and obsidian. I do not use options with obsidian or recipes with obsidian. This is the one I used, but nevertheless other options are viable as well. And when it comes to gold, I simply used gold coins to make gold ingots, and I have not produced any other gold dust other than crude. I haven't produced pure gold dust or any other level of gold dust. Gold dust can also be refined in the refineries, but the only ones I ever used in this playthrough was either crude gold dust, or I used coins to make gold ingots. I have not used anything else but these recipes. Let's look at perfect diamond, because perfect diamond is needed to produce soul. And simply because I was hand feeding limited amount of perfect diamonds into soul shaper to make soul. I didn't need that much, therefore I used this recipe. This is not the best recipe, this is not the most efficient recipe. This recipe was just easy because I had production of Panacea Potion, I had production of lapis lazuli, and I had a lot of gold coins. So all three of these, I had a lot of it, and I just put it all together to make 25 perfect diamonds, and that's all I needed, 25 of each. And yeah, I did not make the production line out of it. I was not producing it constantly, just manually made 25, and that was it. But this is the recipe I used for it. And let's take a look at all the high-end gems. There's other recipes for gems. I used different recipes in my first playthrough, and in this playthrough I solely used World Tree cores, simply because I had so many of them accumulated. I have 2 trees right there, another one in the corner. I had access to World Tree cores, so I just used those. And the recipe for ruby, I used World Tree core, and any of the lowest level materials can be used in other 2 windows here. You can use stone, you can use plank, you can use flax, you can use copper coin. Anything that you put there, as long as it's not 2 of the same, it's still gonna come out as ruby. Well, what do we do next? We use World Tree core and ruby together to produce sapphire, and the third window can be, as again, anything. Can be plank, can be copper coin, can be stone, can be flax. Anything, the lowest level item can go in there, and it's still gonna make sapphire. Then we go next, we use sapphire with World Tree core, and we'll make emerald. And further down, same thing, World Tree core, emerald, and we make philosopher's stone. Obviously, these recipes are using a lot of World Tree cores, but I had so many of them, and I was not making a production line out of them, so I was just simply hand feeding and making these gemstones manually. But this was probably the easiest recipe to deal with, because I didn't have to use anything else but something that I already had a lot of. So again, as we looked at everything, all the early game recipes, I mostly concentrated on making them affordable and making sure that they are usable early game. All the higher end recipes might not be the most efficient, but they're simple. So I highly encourage to experiment with recipes. There's a lot of recipes for the same items. There definitely you can find better recipes than what I found. You can definitely find something that works way better for you in any point of the game, because you gotta use your own discretion and see what makes more sense, what items or what components you have more of, and what can you use in your own recipes, right? And something that works better for you is gonna be a better recipe overall. And what worked for me might not work for someone else, or what works for someone else might not be the best recipe for me, because it all depends on what you produce and how your factory operates. But again, as I was saying, experiment, play with it, try different recipes, find something that works better for you, and that's going to be your best recipe. And with that being said, Corton's out.